If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who spend lots of time in remote areas, what is the creepiest/scariest thing you have encountered? Grew up and still live in a really tiny town. My bedroom's only window faces out to the street, the room's on bottom level, and until I was around 15 there were no blinds on the window. On 2 different occasions, I was sitting on my bed only to look up to see a face staring inside from my window. The person sprinted away quickly, both times. On another occasion, I woke up in the middle of the night, looked out the window and saw a face again, except this time, instead of just running away, the person gave me the finger and then ran away. Going to help some hikers in the fog, and realizing they were maybe 5 feet from going straight over the edge. We were up on the Pennines. Fog rolls in very quickly, and if you're used to that it's not a big deal, you just stay put and wait for it to pass. So me and my mates are sat with a thermos and bacon sarnies, it's all good. Then we hear these 2 voices going hello. Help? Moving towards us. We yell back to them to wait, and after a bit of back and forth they do. We've got hiking sticks and that, so we make our nice and slow way over. Get there and these 2 are maybe 20, with a very nice map and no compass, and no idea where they are. So we sit with them, pour the coffee, and wait for the fog to lift. Then it starts thinning out and we look around. We're on a nice semi-flat patch, there's a few rocks, and a few steps away is the nice, sheer edge of a good-sized drop-off. I used to live in the middle of nowhere. A mile down a dusty dirt road through the woods with only a handful of mobile homes scattered through the pines made sure no one was close enough to help you if shit went down. My closet neighbors were my grandparents. My grandmother fed stray cats, so it was perfectly normal for a random cat to be sulking around. One night I come home well after midnight and a random black cat is sitting on my porch. Whatever, it's catching bugs in the only light around this late at night. As I got out of my car and got to the porch, shit got real. This cat turns its head to look at me, stands up on its hind legs, eyes locked with mine, turns around, runs away from me. It's on its hind legs, pumping its arms as it runs, jumps off the porch, lands on its hind legs, keeps running like a person off into the darkness. A year ago my friend found a pair of panties in a campground. He didn't think anything of it. It is common to find socks and underwear and other small articles of clothing around campsites. He and his girlfriend stayed for the weekend before going home. When he got back, he flicked on the television, and there was a report on the news that campers had found the body of a 12-year-old girl who went missing earlier that week. She was kidnapped, raped, murdered and dumped in the woods. I grew up in a small town. At that time there might have lived 1,000 people there, close to the Alps. One night, me and a friend of mine wanted to drive to a friend's house with our bikes who lived outside of the town. So while we were driving in the pitch black night with no lights anywhere close, we heard a huge enormous bang. At the same time it went from pitch black to daylight bright for a split second. I looked up in the sky and saw a massive burning ball-shaped thing flying overhead of us in the speed of light. If you blinked, you missed it. We both were scared shitless and thought a UFO crashed close to us. You have to imagine this happened all in like 1.5 seconds out of nowhere. The next day my friend wrote the government, XD we were young. Like 12 years old, asking for answers about that UFO. Strangely enough he got a response from the Office of Air Traffic Control, or however you want to call that, and they wrote something like congratulations, what you've seen was a small comet entering the Earth atmosphere. The chances of seeing that is like you get hit by a lightning or win the lottery. Shit was insane, scary but absolutely awesome at the same time. I used to live in the middle of nowhere. We had one neighbor whose house we couldn't even see through the trees and hills. On the other side of us, up another hill there was a dirt road that basically went nowhere. At the beginning of the dirt road there was this old abandoned church which made it automatically creepy. Anyway, berries used to grow down this dirt road so we'd go pick them. On the way back one day we got an extremely strong scent of cologne. A quick scan didn't show anyone, but every time the wind blew we got another whiff. Still don't know where the scent was coming from, but it creeped me out big time. You don't think about how no one could hear you scream until you're forced to. I live in the woods in the middle of nowhere. Creepy stuff happens all the time. When we first moved in here, I kept thinking I'd hear someone walking in the house while I was alone. It's a flood zone, so the house is on stilts and you can hear footsteps when anyone walks across the floor. Of course, this is Texas, so I just grab my handgun and go see if someone had come in. Also, my mother-in-law has a key, and when she drops in and leaves things for the family she sometimes won't relock the door. I kept feeling like I was going to walk into a room and someone would be there. Just feeling oddly watched all day for a few days. My husband didn't think anything of it, and one night he jumped out of bed, grabbed his handgun, and started going through the house, slamming all the doors wide open. He said he heard banging in the kitchen like someone was going through the pantry. He was adamant he had heard someone. Nothing, doors still locked. My niece got home from her grandmother's house and a few nights later asked if she could sleep on a cot in our room. She's a teenager, not a small kid, so I asked her what was wrong. She didn't want to tell us because we wouldn't believe her. Just that she didn't want to be alone. She said she heard banging in the kitchen, and when she heard that or felt like someone was in the house, she would see a man in the window of her room, so she basically noped out and came to us. We let her stay, and the next day we were all a little uneasy. My husband, a notorious non-believer in the paranormal, came in looking shaken and said he had closed her door after bringing her laundry into the room and a man had been smiling at him in the window. The windows on the house are almost 20 in the air because of the stilts the house sits on. I used to have an old cemetery in the woods near my house, had graves in it from the 1840s all the way to 1960s. During the winter when all the leaves had fallen, you could see the clearing from our living room. Every now and then I would walk past the window and catch sight of a guy in a dark black suit just sitting on one of the tombstones, but when I turned it was nothing. It used to drive me freaking insane. I was never really scared of it, just annoyed that it always happened. Eventually I got so sick of it that my cousin and I went out and cleaned up the cemetery, racked all the leaves, pulled out the vines, chopped down a few trees that were growing to close, and even scrubbed down the headstones. Then loudly announced after we were done, "Look, we cleaned this place up for y'all, please stop trying to fuck with us. If you want to sit around, go ahead, but don't just disappear when we look your way." It's really annoying. Never happened to me again, though it did happen to friends when they came over, and my baby brother claims to have gone out and talked to the guy in the suit. Said his name was William. I spent a year living in northern Cali in an extremely remote area. Closest neighbor was 20 minutes further up the mountain. Tons of bears, lynx and mountain lions. We always carried guns if we were going from one part of our property to another. Too many times, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up and I knew I was being tracked by something. All we could do was fire a couple of rounds into the woods and hope it scared whatever it was away. This was probably about 6 or 7 years ago when I was about 16 years old. I lived with my dad on a small farm in southern Oregon. There are about 2 to 3 neighbors spread out around a 5 or so mile radius. Everywhere else is just woods, just these gnarly oak trees and dirt roads leading off to different hunting stands or places for teenagers to go and drink without interruption. My dad plays keyboard in a band, and as long as I can remember he would take off on the occasional Friday or Saturday night to play in one of the local bars, coming back around 2 or 3 in the morning. Anyways, on one of these nights that he was away, me and my brother were playing some Xbox in the front room when I heard the home phone ring. We had a landline back then. I went to pick it up and it happened to be our closest neighbor. His name was Kurt and he operated a full-on dairy farm, unlike our small homesteader-esque farm of a few goats and a couple geese and chickens. So I asked him what was up, as he only really called, and never so late in the night, to tell us about some emergency or situation. Kurt told me, as my blood literally seemed to turn to ice, that someone had been slamming against his barn door. He told me that him and the missus had been watching TV when they noticed between commercial breaks that there was a crashing, splintering sound coming from outside, towards the barn where the horses' stables. Apparently Kurt went outside and found a huge hole in the door to the barn and went in to investigate. I don't really know what he saw inside, but I swear to God, I will remember what he said to me for the rest of my life. Kurt told me that something had broken into his barn, and that there was a smell like nothing he had ever smelled before. The thing he told me, before telling me he was headed to our farm, was that he saw the something loping towards our house. He told me to hang up, to go and take my younger brother and hide. I hung up and just stood there. To be completely honest, I was high as shit. Both me and my brother had been smoking a lot that night, and so I was fairly stunned by what I heard. I went back to the living room where my brother was and sat down, fairly perplexed. This part of the story is where it might seem like fiction, but I swear to God this happened. I started hearing my goats bleeding outside, the way they do when I get home from work or when somebody approaches. They started bleeding, then they started screaming. If you've never heard an animal scream for help, then I envy you. At first my brother and I just sat there, wide-eyed, listening in disbelief and horror, trying to just comprehend what was going on. Then both of us just kind of stood up and started towards the door. I was high, and scared, and I definitely still remembered my conversation with Kurt not 15 minutes ago, and while I'm certainly not a badass by any means, there is no way any compassionate person can listen to a goat or something being murdered and screaming without doing something. That's just what was happening. When we opened the door to the outside, we smelled/heard it already. The sound was utterly horrifying. A pure, unrelenting scream from one of our dear goats, combined with a horrible smell. I can only describe the smell as something like iron. I think that was the goat blood, with a moldy, wet fur, sort of pungent foot kind of smell. I looked from the doorstep. Our goat pen is literally steps away from the door. We love our goats, and saw the horribly mutilated bodies of a few of our goats. Something big was hunched over the carcasses. A couple of the goats were sitting in the corner bleeding helplessly. My brother slammed the door shut and started sobbing. I sat down on the floor, and I'm not ashamed to say I was crying. I'm gonna wrap this up quickly because I hate talking about this, let alone writing about this, but essentially after a few minutes Kurt showed up and a few gunshots later, he came inside to tell us that everything was okay again. He never told us what he saw, but he told my dad. The next day my dad went out and bought a rifle. I live in Billings, Montana. I was in high school about 15 years ago, and as an adolescent with my first car, just driving around at night was a fun activity for us kids during the summer. For a couple of years, we would see this delivery truck driving around residential neighborhoods. It had a cow print on the side and MDS printed over that. So we figured, milk delivery service. These guys weren't out at 4 a.m. though, so we made this joke saying it must be a drug delivery service. So my friends and I tried to follow them a few times. They would routinely turn off their headlights while driving in these residential areas, and if we would try to follow the truck would act sketchy and take weird turns like they were trying to shake us. We got freaked out one night when the truck turned a corner and we went down a block and circled around. The truck had pulled over and right when we went past the street the headlights came on suddenly and the guy floored it. We busted ass back home and stopped that little excursion of trying to chase this guy. The next time I saw one of the delivery trucks was on a main road in the part of town we call the Heights. So his headlights were on, I was driving in the opposite lane so he would pass on my left. I swear to anything you consider holy that last time I saw that truck I did not see a driver. It looked like that truck was driving itself. I still wonder what was up with that weird MDS delivery truck. I saw 3 of them abandoned together in an old junkyard about 5 years later. Still gave me the heebie-jeebies. I live in a pretty rural area, in southwest Nebraska, middle of nowhere, blah blah snore. Okay, so my boyfriend and I were in a heated fight and decided to take it outside so we wouldn't disturb anyone else in the house. So we go outside, past the tree claim at about 11 p.m. total darkness, just empty cornfields every which direction. We commenced screaming at each other and then seemingly out of the sky we heard the loudest stampede. A herd of horses? Charging cattle? Demons? We whipped around to try and see into the blackness where the fuck the noise was coming from, but there was nothing. Just this barreling, monstrous unmistakable fucking stampede noise and us in the massive darkness. We hauled ass back inside and to this day cannot explain WTF that was. Note, we were nowhere near any train tracks by at least 15 miles. I don't live in a rural area, I live in a small town on the south coast of England, and it's true we don't have many scary urban myths or whatnot, but crime is a problem anywhere. When I was in final year of school, so at 16, we used to party in a woodland military training area on the beach side of the town. We used to build a big fire, take an amp and listen to loud music with drugs and alcohol. It was a nice spot, quite secluded and off the dog trails, so besides my group of friends only a few people would know about it. Anyway, at about 11 p.m. on a Saturday me and a couple friends were arriving to this get together a little late, and as we're walking down the main dog walking trail we passed 2 men and a woman. One of the men had his arm locked in hers and the other hand a hand on her shoulder. We didn't think anything of it, the 2 men were laughing and we assumed they were drunk and doing the same thing we were elsewhere in the woodland park. At one point in the night we heard a fox's mating call, you know the one, a gutless scream. Yeah, you can probably see where this is going. So the party goes on well into the night and several of us didn't end up leaving until the sun was coming up. We were already hungover, and by the following Monday morning on the local news, we had heard that 2 Irish men had been arrested following the rape of a 17-year-old girl. In the same place we were partying, only somewhere else in the woodland. She had gone to the police on the Sunday, it turns out they were her brother's friends. It was in the paper, but I don't know what her name was, I don't think they were allowed to release that information to the public. Now the horrible thing is, we saw them. I am 100% certain the 2 men and a girl we saw were those involved in the crime. I'm a little less certain of this, but the fox scream could very well have been her calling out for help. It wasn't scary in the slightest at the time, but thinking back on it still makes me sick to my fucking stomach. Even makes me feel guilty about being obnoxious teenagers and ignoring the outside world to consume as much vodka as possible. Our music no doubt overwhelmed any other noise from that park that night. Horrible story, but no doubt they're still serving jail time. At least they should be. I live in the country, and I spent almost all of last year getting harassed in the middle of the night. I had this habit at the time of going on late night walks throughout the neighborhood/forest, and my family theorizes that I either got too close to where my, now deceased, neighbor was growing weed, or that someone saw me out and decided to take interest in me. The first thing that happened was that I started getting creepy feelings while out walking, like I was being watched from this one point just beyond the edge of the forest next to my house. I thought I was just letting my imagination get the better of me, until I found a condom in the exact spot I was getting the weird vibes from. After that, I would hear knocking on the wall that is actually past the tree line, tapping on the windows, and people talking. I did convince my mother to go check it out a few times, but whoever it was would already be running back through the forest by the time she got outside. Things got so bad that my uncle put up a security camera, but it was displaying a live feed as opposed to actually recording. He also insisted on monitoring from his house, for some reason, and never actually saw anyone on camera. Around this time, someone cut open the cover that was on my grill and stole a storage crate full of my clothing. Once the batteries in the camera died, my uncle decided that it was obviously just my imagination, and took the camera down. Not even a week later, I was walking to my grandparents' house, which is about 100 feet away. Around 11 p.m., I had forgotten to lock their door, when I saw a person in light-colored clothing duck behind their porch. I rushed back down to my house, and my mother offered to go instead of me. She had to chase the man off the property. She didn't see his face or anything, but on the bright side, he ran into a tree. The man was on my property in mid-November of last year, and my neighbor who grew weed in the forest somewhere died in December. Things more or less stopped since then, supporting my family's belief that it was just him and his associates playing some kind of sick joke. The only problem with that theory is that I heard a ringtone sound right outside my bedroom window earlier this year. Unfortunately, this isn't the scariest thing to happen to me involving a late-night creep, just the scariest thing to happen in the middle of nowhere. This is a true creepy story about a random town. This was back when I was in middle school, so 9 years ago. I grew up in a town that was pretty suburban but in a county that was pretty huge because a lot of it was just forest and mountain ranges, but only 30 miles from my state's capital city. My older brother was tasked with driving me to a friend's house one night that was way out into the windy forest roads of the county that he had driven me to a couple times before. So we are almost there and we drive by this dirt road with a fence that I had never seen open before but was that night, and on the map it looked like it was a through street that would lead us right to where we wanted to go and would probably save us some time. There were no private road signs or keep out signs or anything, so he turned down it. After a minute or so we see a couple small buildings and houses almost like an old western town all on this one road, but we don't make it too far down because two guys, one probably 20 years old and the other a teenager standing outside, come up to our car and tap on the window. My brother rolls it down and the older one says, "Hey, are you lost?" And my brother says something like, "No, I'm just trying to get to a friend's house through this road." It was at this time that I noticed the younger one has a creepy stare and holds the same creepy half-smile look on his face the whole interaction, and I started to get really uncomfortable and scared at this point, and the taller one says, "You gotta turn around and go back the way you came." My brother says, "Well, that gate was open and on my map it looks like a through street." Older guy says, "Look dude, I'm trying to help you. You have to turn back now the way you came. Please, and don't come back." So my brother looks at me and probably notices how scared I looked, so he just says, "Okay thanks," rolls up his window, turns right around and drives back out of that creepy gate. It gets more creepy because the next day we went back on Google Maps to try and see if this road had a name or anything, and next to the road it just says Smiley Town, no street, or road or drive or court, just Smiley Town. Which was even weirder because I knew that area was all a part of the same town my friend lived in. I can remember that whole thing so vividly, and last year we were reminiscing about it for the first time since the day with our SOs whom didn't believe us, so we brought up a map on a phone to show, and there was nothing that said Smiley Town anymore, but when we switched to street view all we could see was a barely visible overgrown gate that looked like hadn't been opened in years. I probably thought it was more creepy than it actually was since I was 12 at the time, but still a good story. I live out in the country. There are maybe 5 houses on my long dirt road. Last week my neighbor asked if he could come over to talk to us about something. He didn't knock, just walked right in and had a loaded gun with him. He started talking a mile a minute about a war coming to our road, knowing people who are 300 years old, vampires walking out of woods, being able to see the Matrix code. He had a hospital bracelet on his wrist. Turns out he decided to go off his medication and was in a manic depressive state. The scariest part was waiting for my husband to return from taking the guy back home. The creepiest part of it was when I called his girlfriend to let her know what was going on. She knew he had gone off his meds and thought she could cure him with love. She talked like it was completely normal and didn't seem to be taking it seriously. I reported the incident to the cops, but he ended getting arrested later on an unrelated matter. I feel for the guy, he's back on his meds and getting help now thankfully, but I lock my doors while I'm at home during the day now. I live in a cul-de-sac in the hill country in Texas. Not super remote, but living on over an acre of land separated from neighbors by thick cedar trees and fence line, it feels pretty remote. We used to own quite the livestock, chickens and sheep and ponies, even a peacock pair. One day I went to feed the chickens, we had some hens and a rooster, and found that the chicken coop door was ajar. I immediately noticed the rooster, on its back with its chest split open. I can best describe this by having you imagine the rooster flat in its back and imagine a straight line from the groin between the legs up to the bottom of its neck. Now I know dogs had been a nuisance around this neighborhood, and I figured as much. But this rooster had all of its organs and bones removed and there was no blood anywhere. This rooster was not killed by any animal other than human. So from that point on I was convinced a sadistic prowler had invaded our home and was within 30 feet of our home. I was out and about on one of my family's properties in the Ozarks, somewhere near Mark Twain National Forest. I love the Ozarks, it only takes a few ridges to achieve that feeling of total isolation. Anyway, it was rather warm out, and as I normally do, I decided to take a nap. Picking a large exposed rock surface, edge of a cliff, more like looking back it was stupid, I could have rolled off, so I laid down and closed my eyes, but it felt like something was watching me. This isn't totally odd as there are literally thousands of little critters, but the feeling of presence it emitted was larger. But whatever, I shrugged it off. About 30 minutes later I wake up, but I kept my eyes closed. It had definitely gotten nearer. I muttered that I was awake, and rather than hearing a scurrying type noise, rabbit, squirrel, deer, etc., I heard slow heavy footfalls, sauntering away, and it was definitely only bipedal. That's what it sounded like. There were no tracks left by anything that sounded that heavy. I still love hiking out there. I grew up in a small town in California. Our claim to fame is we are the exact center of California. The town is about a mile long with people scattered all over the mountainside. My grandparents' house is on a 10-acre property bordering the Sierra National Forest. We have neighbors lose by we are unable to see their lights because of the thick trees. The house is built right at the back property line about 100 feet from the National Forest on a hill. To the left the hill rises and is filled with trees and brush you can only see about 20 feet in. To the left the hill drops and looks over a valley. We have mountain lions that scream in the distance every once in a while, and it's one of the most comforting sounds to hear. The property has always given me an uneasy feeling. Everything just seems dead, we hardly see any wildlife despite being pretty deep in the woods. No birds, squirrels, or deer. Plants die and I hardly find any insects. When I was 8-10 years old I lived with my grandparents. My room was on the right of the house and the windows faced the hill. I had bunk beds and slept on the top. Most nights would wake up in the middle of the night with freezing feet and I felt like something was in my room. One night I woke up to a tug on my ankle. My eyes shot open, I was petrified, my feet were freezing, my covers had been pushed up and my feet over the edge a bit. I just stayed still, then I felt a tug again. I looked to the foot of the bed and saw the face of a woman. She looked young but like she had been slightly mummified. She had a mischievous smile that was impossibly large on her face and her fucking eyes were green. She didn't glow but she seemed to have an aura around her. The scream got sucked out of my body and I started kicking and then she was gone. I was too sacred to move but I turned on my lamp the rest of the night. The next morning I had a bruise on my ankle. My mom also has some creepy stories from when she was growing up there too. Several years ago I'd been out to visit my grandpa before he passed away and I stayed until way after dark. Nearest neighbors are about half a mile away to the north or east through dense woods. He walked to the door with me and I went out and down the porch steps, and just as I reached the very edge of the area lit by the porch light I felt something. No idea what triggered it, but the hair on my arm stood up, my heart started pounding, and reflexively I drew my handgun and took half a step back into the light. Nothing was apparently looming in the dark to eat my face, but I heard a noise from the porch and stole a look back. Grandpa had stepped out and was holding the screen door open with his foot, pointing the shotgun that stays by the door out into the darkness. I backed up the steps, leaving him a relatively safe shot over my left shoulder. Once we'd both backed into the house and bolted the door, we sat up all night trying to hash out what had tripped both of our oh shit switches. Never came up with a satisfactory answer, but he did tell me the only other times he'd felt that dread were on Iwo Jima in 1945. We'd both spent significant amounts of time hunting, camping, foraging, and just walking through the woods at all times of the day and night, and never felt anything close to that, at least not from someone/something we couldn't see. One time I was on my PC playing some CSGO, my bedroom window is directly behind me. I was home alone with no one nearby as my house is so far from any town, and my blind was up. I was just playing as normal and it was about 10 at night. Suddenly a flashlight shone through my window and I turned around quickly to find a figure running away. I was terrified for the rest of the night, turned all the lights on and sat in my room too scared to even play. You can call me a bitch all you want, but for someone who suffers from anxiety this was very scary for me. I told my parents the next day as they were gone for the night and they wanted to ring the police about it. I told them not to because whoever it was did nothing and we had no evidence. Thinking back, maybe it's a good thing I was home and they shone that light in my window. Maybe my house would have been robbed if I wasn't there. I have been traveling the US in my van trying to get to all the US national forests. They are never crowded and I frequently go a full week at sites without seeing a single person. While camping in South Carolina, at a particularly secluded spot, a truck pulled in at about 2 a.m. It was strange enough that someone was coming into the site, much less in the middle of the night when it is pitch black. The truck pulls up past my car and drives on this field that had a water pump. A full-grown man hops out and starts filling up a big bucket with water. Once it's full, he threw all the water on the hood of his car. He repeated this for about half an hour while mumbling to himself. After that he rummaged around in the bed of his truck for a few minutes and then sped off. There is a very good chance that he never knew I was there. I am not sure what that man was doing, but it sure scared the hell out of me. I could only imagine the worst. I went to this very small town in the middle of nowhere on top of a mountain in Tennessee. It was the middle of winter and we were supposed to clean out a barn. Night came very quickly and we needed something from the house. Problem was, the house was a 15-minute walk away in the middle of the woods, and it was pitch black. I was walking down the trail for about 5 minutes and I heard noises. They were coming from my east and sounded like screaming. I was so scared that I ran the rest of the way. At the house I grabbed the thing we needed and a flashlight. On my way back, I checked the area the screaming came from and found it to be a cliff. I looked down and saw nothing. When I got back to the barn I told my uncle, who lived there, about what happened. He told me that not too long ago a man slipped and fell off the cliff. I got more stories about this place because it's such a cryptic and terrifying town. 16 years ago I was living in Borden, England. 13, walking home from school one evening, through the woods, and I heard this shrill scream when I was about 100 feet away from the edge of the woods. I quickened my pace seeing as the sun was setting. As I get to the second to last turn to get out of there, a 2 feet white sphere with a faint glow to it flies out in front of me and hangs there. At face level I am 6 feet 3 inches, for about 1.5 seconds, and takes off with the same scream I had just heard. About 2 seconds after that, a black shadowy sphere launches out of the same bush chasing the first sphere, stops dead in its tracks, and looks at me with 2 red glowing eyes, fucking roars, think demonic silverback gorilla scream, after at least 4 to 5 seconds of inspecting me, then takes off after the first one. Cut to about 10-ish years ago, I'm having dinner with a friend's parents on the Ramtha property, Olympia, WA, and this story comes up. The father gets up after hearing what I have to say and comes back with an old as hell picture of the shadow thing. He told me what I saw was a Mothman, and that I was lucky it was hunting something else because people who encounter it usually die. I don't know if this was a sign from God warning me not to go, but of course this post shows on my feed just a day before I'm supposed to leave for a week in a cabin at Letchworth National Park in NY State, and of course I read every single post and comment so far, even commenting on a few, only to realize the sun was coming up already and I've been up since 3 a.m. reading this thread unable to fall back asleep. And to make this infinitely worse, this entire camping trip was planned and booked around the plan to celebrate my buddy's graduation from graduate school, with a much needed acid trip in the woods with 4 childhood friends. I'm not exaggerating for strangers on Reddit when I say I'm having serious second thoughts about going, let alone tripping acid. I think I'm already fucked. The thoughts have all been planted in my head after reading all these posts. Add the acid and it's only a matter of time until I jump off one of the 15 waterfalls trying to escape the boy or the fucking Lebanese djinn. God damn it, why did I have to read about the fucking djinn? Oh well, I'm $500 spent on drugs, food, and lodging already. I'll just tell my buddies we are throwing out all the raw meat before we even get there, fruit and veggies only this trip. Motherfucking djinn, why? And with my luck, I'll get the cabin with a pair of murder panties in them and some Jason Voorhees quadruple homicide backstory to go with the cabin. My grandma's is out in the country close to land where deer and elk roam. I was little, I was playing by myself by the barn, and heard what sounded like a woman screaming bloody murder. It was so loud and screechy it almost paralyzed me in fear, but managed to sprint back to the house as fast as I could. Told my family about it and we pondered on what it was. Grandpa said there were signs of cougar tracks at the local farms around the area, but we all passed that off. About a year ago I was on YouTube with my parents and we somehow got to a video of a mountain lion, cougar, puma, screeching on a game trail camera, and it was 100% what I heard that day at the barn. I live out in rural Oklahoma and I frequently photograph landscapes and abandoned buildings. I was driving away from the city way out in the country on dirt roads when I passed a burnt down house with just the brick chimney remaining in the middle of where the house once stood. I am in the middle of nowhere at this point, almost to Guthrie, Oklahoma. This is a prime stop for me, so I pull over to check it out, by myself, and shoot some photos. Everything in the house was charred or burnt completely. There were little girls' shoes in a pile, half-burned mattresses, and some old mason jars strewn about, as well as other common household items, books, shelves, couches, old food, etc., so I'm assuming the fire was an accident. It was a great looking place and would have been awesome to stay and shoot more of, but when I finally reached the corner of the house and turned around to figure out where I was going to shoot from, my eyes were immediately drawn to the fireplace, which I had only seen from the back, where there sat two dolls inside sitting upright, hands sewn to each other, staring at me with no burn marks or black soot or ash anywhere on them, completely untouched by the fire, just a little dirty and slightly aged. I was by myself and I'm not a huge fan of dolls anyway, so I stayed long enough to get a photo of the dolls and sprinted to my truck and left. I tried to go back about 5 or 6 days after this with friends because there was a cellar I never made it in but wanted to check out, and the entire house had been cleaned up foundation to, and was just a dirt plot for sale where the house was, with 150 plus acres available. A friend and I once found an abandoned campground in the middle of the West Virginia wilderness. It looked like everyone who was there just screamed. There were coolers still filled with drinks and backpacks with things still in them. Looking at the snack logos, they were from around the late 90s or early 2000s. We found them in 2014 or so. Since that area is known for recreational drug use, we assumed the campers were doing drugs and got busted by the cops. It was a weird, surreal feeling seeing that everything had been left, though. I was walking around the nature preserve behind my house playing our predecessor to Pokemon Go, ingress at about 2 a.m. with my buddy. We walked past the empty water reservoir when he stopped. Looked out into the basin with our flashlight. Just so many eyes. Had to be like 30 coyotes. As soon as the light hit all those eyes, they started barking. Including barking behind us and to the sides. We bailed as fast as we could, sprinted back the mile-ish run back to my place, no damage but scared. We didn't live there, but my family used to own a farm on about 110 acres in the backwoods of Missouri. We would go there on long weekends, for holidays, during the summer, etc., but we would usually be gone for weeks at a time, sometimes months. It was about a half-hour drive from the nearest town, basically a gas station, motel, a restaurant and a convenience store, and an hour drive from the nearest big store, a huge super Walmart. Our closest neighbors were about a mile away, and the only way you would know our farm was there is if you knew to look for the gap in the trees that led to our driveway. Anyways, one time we come down for a long weekend, it's night, and we realize the door to the house is unlocked, which is weird, because we always lock it. My dad goes in, and we find that the only things that had been stolen were a video camera, a chainsaw, and a gun. We called the sheriff, he came by the next morning. We never figured out who broke in or how. Apparently about a month before, my dad said he saw some guys on a pickup on the edge of our property, and when my dad went to confront them, they drove off. Suffice to say, I was completely unnerved every time we went there from then on.